Welcome back. Let's spend a few minutes thinking about marginal cost. And importantly, what does the curve that goes with marginal cost look like? So we're going to look at it one way, sort of maybe the reality, and then we're going to think about it in a slightly simpler way, making a couple of assumptions. So what is marginal cost? Well, marginal cost is just the increase in the total cost that arises from an extra unit of production. In other words, if a firm is going to produce one more unit, what happens to their costs, right? What's the cost of that marginal, that additional unit of output? So let's think about this first in sort of a more realistic sense, right? So in reality, this marginal cost and the curve that goes with it is probably non-linear. Right? It's non-linear. What the heck does that end up looking like? Well, it's probably going to be U-shaped. All right, so let's think about why. So to do that, we're just going to set up a graph, and we want to compare marginal cost, right? That's in dollars, compared to the quantity of output. So if you think about it in terms of, let's say you've got a restaurant, right? How expensive is that first meal to produce? Well, it's probably fairly expensive because you've got one worker likely who has to greet the guests, seat them, take their order, go back, cook it, etc. So your marginal cost for that first meal is probably pretty high. Now, what if this restaurant expands a little bit? Now they have two meals. Okay, well maybe this worker can seat both guests and maybe take one order, then take the next order, then go back to the kitchen and cook them both at the same time and carry them both out. Right? If you're sort of thinking this story through, what has happened to the cost as we think about that extra order? Well, it's not as high because this worker isn't running back and forth like they used to. Right, so this marginal cost for the next meal is going to be lower. Maybe they hire some additional help. So, okay, somebody's working the host stand, and somebody else is working on cooking the meals in the back, so they can split up the tasks, right? Maybe one person's front of the house, one person is back of the house. And you can imagine the marginal cost becoming cheaper. So this is just finding efficiencies in production, right? There are efficiencies in the scaling up of the size of the restaurant. But eventually, probably start to see this process reverse. So maybe after you've got a host, a waitress or waiter, and a cook, now when you hire an additional worker, yeah, they could help increase output, but by not as much as the prior hires did. So now the marginal cost starts to increase. Then maybe we hire another cook. Well, now the cooks are banging into each other in the back of the restaurant. So what does this marginal cost curve look like? Well, initially we saw these decreases in marginal cost as the restaurant became more efficient. But eventually you start having people bang into each other, get in their way. Maybe they're not as skilled as the first workers that were hired. And we see marginal cost start to increase. So what are our terms for some of these areas or different spots on this marginal cost curve? Right? So in this first part, we see gains from specialization. That's probably what's driving this. Right? This sort of early part is gains from specialization. One person handles the front of the house, one handles the back. Cool, now we're more efficient. Two people are actually producing more than two individuals, right? The sum of the parts is not as great as the whole in that case. The two of them working together, you see this increase in output. But what's going on over here, right? Why is this marginal cost increasing? What drives that? Well, this comes from diminishing marginal product. Right? Diminishing marginal product. So if we want to try to produce more meals, we're going to need more inputs into it. Well, each subsequent input that we put to work, think about it as maybe labor, isn't as valuable as the prior one. So if our diminishing or each input of labor is producing less output, then what's happening to our costs? Those costs are going up. So if we want to sort of think about these against each other, well, what would that look like? So if you thought about the marginal product of labor versus the units of output, what's this initial phase, right? As we hire more people, each worker becomes more productive because now they're not switching tasks, they're not running from the kitchen out to the front, etc. But eventually we hit the point where we've got too many workers and they're starting to bump into each other, or the next person we hire maybe isn't trained or doesn't have as many skills. So now that marginal product of labor starts to decrease. So what's happening is we're seeing these increasing gains from specialization, etc. Costs go down. Once this marginal product of labor drops off, now our costs start increasing. So in reality, marginal cost curves are probably U-shaped. Now that's a fairly complicated story to keep straight when we start laying other stuff on top of it. So sometimes we just often make the assumption that we're in this diminishing marginal product phase of the marginal cost curve. So let's assume, right? So we could assume diminishing marginal product. So if we just make the assumption of diminishing marginal product, that means that we can ignore the sort of left-hand piece of this marginal cost curve. So this now makes it much easier to think about. If we just assume we're in the diminishing marginal product piece of this, then we're looking at marginal cost in dollars versus quantity. And what does this look like? It looks like just an upward sloping curve of marginal cost. So essentially what we're doing when we're assuming diminishing marginal product is we're ignoring this startup phase. We're ignoring this part where a restaurant says, oh, we need somebody else other than the owner. We need a host or a hostess or a waiter or a waitress kind of thing, right? We've gotten past that. Where are we looking at from there? We're looking at what happens if they expand production, if they expand output beyond that point. In which case, then we've got this nice clean marginal cost curve that's upward sloping. So for many of our problems, we may just make this assumption to keep it simple, so we've got a nice clean marginal cost curve. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. Work through this more involved story and then say, well, let's just simplify it and let's just make this assumption and focus only on the second part. Hopefully you've got a feel for this. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.